Do you want to know how you can deal with a customer who's screaming at you down the phone or in person, spitting in your face as they're being totally rude, inappropriate, and essentially super angry? How you can deal with them without apologizing? Then this episode is for you. Hello Sales Nation and welcome to today's episode of the Sales Man Podcast. On today's show we have Jay Heinrichs. He is a persuasion and conflict consultant. He is the author of Thank You for Arguing, which you can find on Amazon, and we link to it in the show notes of this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com as well. On today's show, that's what we're diving into, arguing. How we can deal with someone who is being emotional, shouting in our faces as a salesperson, as a customer, and then the wider reaching effects of this as well, of dealing with confrontation, arguments at home, and a whole lot more. So with all that said, let's jump straight in. Jay, welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Thanks, Will. Great to see you.
I'm glad to have you on, mate. We're going to dive into angry customers, and I love this topic when kind of we went back and forth and you pitched this one to us of clearly we've all had this, but more importantly than just sales and business, it goes beyond that. It goes into dealing with your partner, girlfriend, wife, husband, whoever, being mad at you for, I know it happens to me, for all the stupid things that I do consistently. And so being able to communicate better with people, both in sales and just in life in general, I think there's a lot of value to go out with this one. So I'm going to ask you somewhat of a leading question here to get us rocking and rolling. And that is there a process to dealing with someone who's either on the phone angry at you or in person, even worse, perhaps angry at you? Or is this a case of you go off your gut feeling and you try and respond with, similar or opposite emotions, and you're less thoughtful about the process?
Well, if your gut feeling works for you, go with your gut feeling. It just doesn't for me. So yes, I have to use a strategy, and that's really what I teach. Rhetoric is all about the strategy and conversation, and makes you a better salesperson if you know what the strategy is. So there are a couple of things that you can do. I call them tools. The chief tool to think about, because it's really easy to think about, is, you remember from grammar school about your tenses, past, present, and future. When someone is angry with you, usually they're going to be speaking either in the past tense, look what you did, or in the present tense, well, you are a jerk, or worse. The future tense is where you can solve problems for all time. Can I tell you a quick story?
Of course you can.
So my son is a real master at this. And some years ago, even at the age of 15, he was a master. He used up all the toothpaste in the bathroom. I was standing there alone. And being the father of a 15-year-old son, I knew who the likely culprit was. So I shout through the closed door of the bathroom, George, who used up all the toothpaste? And I hear this sarcastic voice on the other end saying, that's not the point, is it, Dad? The point is, how are we going to keep this from happening again? Now, what he had done was he had switched from the past tense, which Aristotle, the philosopher, called forensic rhetorics, where forensics, crime and punishment, take place, to the future, where we can solve the problem together and he stays out of trouble. Now, the cool thing about that was I was just so excited that he had been listening to me while I was talking about all these great tools of rhetoric. That I let him win. What I did say, though, by the way, and this is really important in taking the anger out, I conceded his point, and I said, okay, George, you win. Now will you get me a tube of toothpaste? And he did. He went down into our freezing basement, and he got me a tube. So who won that argument? I got a teenager to run an errand willingly. And that is the other thing is, in a lot of times you feel like you have to defend yourself, because often when a customer is angry with you, it may be unfair. And best salespeople, of course, will concede that point. They set their goal at the beginning. What do they want? Well, they want to make the sale, or they want to keep a customer. They want to keep the relationship. And so by conceding the point, focusing on the goal, switching to the future, you actually can win in the end, no matter how angry the person is. Can I say one more thing just about that? Because this is a really important part of argument in general. Aristotle, who invented logic as we know it, basically said that you can throw logic out the window when it comes to persuasion. Instead, when people are angry, they often feel as if they've been belittled, as he put it. In other words, made to seem less than what they are. It's the chief cause of litigation in the United States against doctors. And so what you need to do is to make sure that you're showing the utmost respect for the customer when they're angry. And so that's it. I just gave you 3 things. That's a package of 3 anger reducing tools.
When we're showing respect, especially in the dynamic between a sales professional and the customer, are we trying to be on the same level as them, or are we pandering to them, listening to what might be complete bullshit that they're spouting out just because they're angry and emotional in the moment, and then we go for the long-term win after the fact? Or should we always try and be on the level and not suck it up too much and essentially look weak in front of them?
Yeah, that is a really good point. So we're actually in the realm now of apologies, aren't we? Because often what happens when a customer is angry, they want you to apologize. They may demand that. You see this in politics as well all the time, of course. The problem is when people are looking for an apology or they're so angry with you, they want to belittle you. They want you to sort of self-belittle. They want you to shrink to their size, or preferably smaller. The problem is that's not going to fix anything. And ultimately what the customer wants is a fix. And so if you show respect, what you can do is honor the other person and understand why they're angry. So the big thing is to think about how the customer identifies herself or himself. You know, are they a homeowner trying to protect their income, their spending? Are they a husband who is disappointed a wife in a gift? Whatever it is, you know, whoever the customer is. Think about how they're identifying themselves and praise that identity. You know, look, you're acting like a good husband. I understand that, but let's fix it. Then switch to the future right away, because that's what they want. If you say, oh, I'm so sorry, I really feel awful, and you know, or worse, if you say, I'm sorry, I made you feel awful, talking about their feelings, all you're doing is shrinking yourself or further belittling them. Get into the fix as soon as you can. And by the way, the big thing is to acknowledge your mistake. One of the things I tell people is you can actually enhance what in rhetoric we call your ethos, which is your character or your image, to the other person, even more from making a mistake if you recover properly from it, especially if you really did make that mistake. What you can say is, look, I screwed up, or my company screwed up. We're going to fix this. We're going to put all hands on deck for this. But I got to tell you, this is something we don't do. This is an exception to the rule, and it makes me all the more committed to do better for you. And customers love that. One of my clients is Southwest Airlines, and they're geniuses with that. You know, people screw up. They have 40,000 employees. Somebody's going to screw up every week. And they are just brilliant at saying, we put all hands on deck. This is the exception to the rule. We're going to fix this, and we're all the more committed for having made this mistake.
How do we frame this if we haven't made a mistake? Because clearly from the conversation so far, we shouldn't pander and necessarily over-apologize. Is there a way to take someone's anger, and perhaps we'll dive into in a second different types of being angry, whether it's emotional, whether there's a logical anger, we'll dissect that in a second. But someone's throwing a load of abuse at us. Typically, I almost feel like they should then apologize for throwing the abuse. So when I do this, or unintentionally, there's no strategy behind it, in the back of my brain, I'm going, hey, shouting at me when I've done nothing wrong. And again, I don't want to pander and look weak, because that'll damage the long-term relationship that I have with that individual, you know, outside of the realm of just the conversation that we're having now, just in the business deal. If they see you as a weak individual who can't solve their problems, how do you deal with it when you haven't done anything wrong? There's been perhaps a miscommunication. There's been, you promised a delivery date, and then that went from the receptionist to the executive, and there was a mistake there, and you know that you could just drop them in it. How do you go about framing it? So, because clearly you don't want to drop anyone in it, I'm guessing. How do you frame that up so that you take that moment of abuse, but then don't accept the blame for it?
Yeah, so you're really talking about 2 situations, aren't you? One is where a screw up didn't happen and the customer got it wrong, right? Yeah. So the customer misinterpreted what the delivery date was, wrote it down wrong, and now is angry because he didn't meet that date. On the other hand, your company screwed up, or someone within your company did. Those are kind of separate situations. Nonetheless, what you want to do is to change from the screw up to a choice. So what you're doing is we're getting technical here a little bit. We're changing the type of rhetoric. The most useful kind of rhetoric to use, the one where anger does no good for anybody, and people eventually recognize that, is the rhetoric of choices. It's called deliberative rhetoric, where the two of you will fix a problem or work toward the future. That's why I mentioned changing the tense being very important. So either way, what you need to do is to say, okay, look, we need to make good. Now, it may be hard because if you missed a delivery date, you can't go back in the past and fix that, obviously. But you can say, look, how were you hurt by this? Let's fix that. So in other words, you missed the child's birthday or something like that. And you can say, let's make it better for your kid. Let's come up with a surprise. Your goal, which you have to have in mind all the time, is how do you make your customer love you for that mistake and how well you recovered from it? That's hard. I mean, don't get me wrong. But if that's what you focus on, you're bound to do better in the future. That's how you build the kind of trust you need as a salesperson.
How do we do all of this, Jay, without, I'm going to use the stereotype of and the stereotype might be different in different countries, I appreciate that, but here in the UK, the stereotype of a British politician, most of the time, well, the ones that win and get into Parliament, they're a bit smarmy, they're quick-witted, they can come up with a response very quickly, but there's not a lot of trust there, and there's numerous levels to that which we don't need to dive into the politics of it. But that's a stereotype that I see, and I feel that you might be able to get away with what you just described and changing the tense of things and future pacing and coming up with solutions. But there will be people, myself included, occasionally in this, that will say something back to the customer that could perhaps even make things agitate them slightly. Is there a way to train ourselves to get better at this before we go all in and pour potentially a load of petrol on a flaming bonfire?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is to be yourself and don't try to be anything that you're not. And if they don't like you, they don't like you. One of the problems that I find often in salespeople is that because the character, the type of person who goes into sales and loves it, they want to be liked, and that's often a big mistake. It's actually better to think, how do I do a great job here? Not whether the customer likes me. So part of it is to be really blunt. And that's one thing. Don't use fancy language. Don't use doublespeak. Don't use euphemisms. Say, this sucks. I know this sucks for you. The second thing you do is to use what in rhetoric we call the advantageous. All right, let's talk to what will be to your advantage right now. Let's not only fix this, let's make it better for you. You tell me exactly what you want. And, if the person then says, well, first of all, I want you to apologize. You could say, sure, I'll apologize all you want, but that's still not going to fix the problem. Be absolutely, blunt, direct, and look as honest as you possibly can. The other thing, and this is more important for women than for men, psychologically, a lot of tests have shown this. Be very careful with how you inflect your voice. And women tend to inflect their voice, as I do too. I talk too much like the way women do when they get themselves in trouble in conversation. I get excited.
Sorry, Jay, I should do that more often because my voice is very much this, and people are listening to me for hours and hours on end. So I'm interested in this because I need to inflect my voice a little bit more to make it more interesting.
Oh, I don't think you do, actually, Will. I think the important thing here is timing and pauses. So what I tell people, especially women who say they don't get paid attention enough in meetings or they're having trouble in sales, I'll say, watch every George Clooney movie, especially Ocean's 11. Watch that 20 times until you just can't stand the guy and try to imitate him because Clooney is a genius. I mean, everything. First of all, he's got that nice deep voice, which you can train yeah. for. I've tried. I need a lot more training personally for that. But the interesting thing is that he speaks in this consistent, deep monotone. But what he does, if he wants to emphasize a point, he pauses. And we often feel as if there's just so little time we're under so much pressure to get meetings done or make the sale or whatever. We often talk too fast, too quickly, filling in every gap. And instead of worrying about whether your voice is interesting or not, instead, it's actually better because it makes you trust that people think you're a more powerful person and a more trustworthy as well if you actually pause occasionally. It makes you sound more sincere. See what I'm doing here? I mean, I'm terrible at it, honestly. I'm sure that many people are better. George Clooney is the master. Watch his movies.
Cool. All right. So you made me smile then as you were giving that answer, Jay. If a politician, because I was visualizing this as you said it, if a politician, clearly everyone screws up. Politicians can't be, just by the very nature, if there's only two parties, they're going to be wrong half the time because they were voted in by half the people who didn't want half of the things that they kind of voted for with the opposition. So there's plenty of opportunity to say this sucks. If a politician said this sucks, paused on obviously clearly television, radio, podcast, whatever you're listening to them, whatever you're consuming them on, and then asked, the people, or, it would be simpler to ask the interviewer, perhaps, what do you think? Or, to just get an opinion. From one angle, it seems slightly weak in that they're kind of going, okay, I was wrong. But to use a word that you used then, it makes them sincere. And that is fascinating to me. And my face lit up as you said that. I've never been on the phone having complained or through an email and complained about something and had someone say, I'm sorry, this sucks. Let's solve the problem. As blunt, the word you use again was blunt. And I think that's fascinating in itself. Why don't people do that? Is it because they are scared of looking weak, or they don't want to give in, or they're just not trained?
That's a good question that honestly I can't fully answer. I know that Southwest Airlines is very good at this, and they do. And they will say, quote unquote, this sucks. Let's fix it. We're going to put all hands on deck for you. They use that expression as well. So, sometime tweet Southwest whenever they've screwed something up. They will respond personally to your tweet, and they will use language like that, deliberately very blunt. I think it is, it must be training, because these people are trained to do that. One of the reasons I think people don't, you mentioned politicians, by the way, what politicians go through is a very different kind of phenomenon where everything they say is going to be sliced up by the opposition and used out of context. So if you say this sucks, eventually it will come out as you saying America sucks. If, on the other hand, you're being direct and honest and asking for the opinion of a journalist, I could tell you I have a background in journalism, and I reported on the Capitol Hill in Washington for years. If a politician ever said that to me, I would have been not only astonished, I would have said, you mean you don't know? Like, you're supposed to be a leader. So I think that's very different. I think it's very different. So
let me ask you this then, Jay, just on that point then. Does the way that you deal with angry people change within the context that you're in that a politician does things one way, a leader, a C-suite executive who is apologizing to someone further down the rung would perhaps act in a different way, to me apologizing for annoying my girlfriend from constantly winding her up and you're kind of pushing her over the limit of what she can take from that perspective, I would have to apologize in a different way. Do we have to be conscious of the scenario that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, people get PhDs in rhetorical audience theory to figure out how to respond differently to each situation.
Okay.
There is actually, you're at a really interesting. I love throwing out these nerdy words. You have to forgive me for them, but there's this really important concept in rhetoric called kairos, which is the art of the occasion. So knowing how to respond to the occasion, say the right thing at the right time to the right people, is an amazing art. And the ancient Romans respected it so much. And Romans, by the way, were very persuasive people. They didn't just conquer the world, they persuaded it, right? And so all of us speak some version of Latin, as a result. They actually invented a god, or believed one existed, called occasio, the art of the occasion. So you are talking about different things. So for a politician dealing with an angry person, that politician will know that it's more than one angry person, right? It's going to be thousands, possibly millions of angry people. And the politician has to say, how important is this group? And if I talk to this group and appease them, am I going to be making more people angry? When you're talking about your girlfriend, unless you have several, you don't really have that same problem. And there it's a matter of actually, one of the things I say in a corporate setting is you actually should probably never apologize, because it basically shrinks you in front of your audience. I said that once in front of a group of marketing people. About 2/3 of them were women, and they almost tore me apart because these women were thinking, not in the corporate context, but how the men in their lives never apologize, and they always do, So I actually have ended up saying, say you're sorry if people expect it. Why not? But that's not going to get you anywhere in any situation. So saying you're sorry is more likely, more useful with your girlfriend. But still, you have to move on at the same time. That's very different. Politicians saying they're sorry, they're always in trouble when they do. What they should say, and this is often interpreted as an apology, which is great, is to say, look, mistakes were made. You don't use a passive voice. You say, I screwed up. I made a mistake. I'm going to acknowledge that. I own it. You could say that as well. It's a very powerful expression. Look, I'm going to own this. But more importantly, I'm going to fix this. And so if someone accuses during a debate or whatever of, this is just the kind of politician that doesn't work in Britain, this is ruining our country. You could say, look, call me all the names you want, but that's not going to fix this problem. Can we now talk about fixing the problem? You seem very bad at that, but I'm good at fixing problems.
So you just did something there that I wanted to wrap up the show with, Jay, and that is we'll talk about when we should turn the tables with this, and then how we go about doing it. Clearly, if there's a debate, it's fine to own it, and then you want to put the pressure back on the other person, because it's more important to be the person that, and tell me if I'm right or wrong here, but seemingly it's more important to be the person that doesn't crumble versus the one who got the leg up, if that makes sense. So how do we know when we should go poof and turn this back on the other person? And then are there any frameworks, are there any processes to go about doing that?
If you're talking about a fairly personal conversation where you have a customer you've been close to or dealt with for many years, start by talking about your own feelings, not that of the customer. I know this is very counterintuitive, especially if you're an empath. What you should do is to say, I screwed up, so you own it. I feel terrible about this. I did you wrong. I feel really bad. Now, what I'm going to need to do is, you have to trust me because we've worked together for years. I'm going to fix this. So, all right, that's plan A. On the other hand, if you don't have a close relationship where you've had trust in the past, because usually what happens, by the way, if you have established that trust, your customer is going to say, I can't believe you did this. You are my favorite person to deal with, and now look what you did. What they're actually doing is acknowledging that trust which you temporarily violated. So you could say, you're right, I temporarily, screwed up, but I'm going to fix this. Now, if you don't have that kind of relationship, pushing back is not a bad idea. To say, look, you keep talking about what I did. I acknowledge that. But let's talk about how we're going to fix that. I'm very good at that. You can keep accusing me of this, but all it's going to do is leave you in limbo. You see what I'm doing here? Now, that's pushing back. It's not, what you don't want to do is attack the other person, unless you're running for office and you're in a debate. Then you totally attack the other person by saying, all you love to do is just talk about what happened in the past, because that's all you care about is the past. I'm talking about the future of the UK, which right now is in trouble, and I'm the one to fix it. That's very different, right? Where you don't even like the person.
Does this work when it's, I don't know how to describe it, almost like non-linear, of the other person isn't in the room? And I'll give you the scenario here of, you are a salesperson, you've gone to tender, there's multiple salespeople involved pitching for the business, and they've said something about you, and the pressure's onto you to either prove them wrong or dismiss it. Can you use rhetoric? Can you go back and forth with someone when there's essentially a person in the middle of all of this?
Actually, this is the main sales I happen to do. I pitch a lot of RFPs and requests for proposal, and And I also train people to do that. And one of the things I do is, you're going to be criticized, especially if you're a firm that's well known or a person, So the thing to do is to demean the competition through praise. So in the American South, there's this wonderful expression. Women use it more than men, but it's perfect, which is bless his heart, which is a way of saying this is a total loser. Bless his heart. So what you do is you have that attitude of love, like pure, send love beams out of your eyes and say, I love that guy. Isn't he hilarious? He's great. So, that's just the sort of thing he does. And I love his sort of dog-eat-dog demeanor. But honestly, I think you'd find me a lot more pleasant to work with, or the other thing I do, by the way, is I try to disarm any criticism coming from anywhere else. I tell teams, look, at the very least, make this the best time of the client's day. Like make it more fun than any other part of their day. And if they're seeing one group after another, or one salesperson after another, just be the one who's best to be with. And already you're going to achieve what psychologists call cognitive ease, which is the most persuasive state for a person to be in, where they feel powerful and comfortable and happy. That's ultimate. And every salesperson already knows that, I'm sure.
I love this. So I went from, regular listeners will know this, in medical device sales, I went from one company that had a Japanese corporate culture. It was very much, we were not pushy, but we document everything and we go through a very strategic process to close a deal. So you'd go out of you'd leave a meeting with a surgeon after you'd just been talking about endoscopic camera systems or endoscopy in general, and you'd get told off. You'd literally have someone micromanaging you on the phone if you didn't leave that meeting, and then document it straight away. I moved from that company to the biggest competitor, and they're both the most prestigious companies in the space. But I moved to the competitor that had no CRM system, no way of documenting things. It was very much get out there, close some deals. We know we've got the best products. And so what I used to do when I moved from one to the other, I used to do what you just described. And there's a fine line between being a dick about it, and no one likes spending time with someone who's just aggressively going after other people, especially when they're not there to defend themselves. But I used to do what you described of, it'd be like, oh yeah, they've come and seen you, they've had a meeting, bless them, they were sat outside probably for 25 minutes typing it all up word for word, and I would belittle them in that I'd be positioning them as they're micromanaged, they can't work on their own, they don't have the skill sets to just be able to go and mingle in a hospital and deal with all the individuals. They've got to bring the boss out with them all the time. And so you could frame it the other way around as well, of these are all cowboys, we document everything because we give a professional service, so you can put your own spin on it. But that's what came to mind when you were going through that scenario then. And I've got one thing I want to wrap up on here, Jay, and that is the different types of anger. Because I've had a customer on the phone before, there's one case that kind of shines to me, and he got on the phone, dealt with it completely wrong. I didn't accept the responsibility. I can't remember the scenario now, whether it was my fault or not, but at the time I was at a big sales meeting, and immediately then he rang my boss. So hung up with me, then rang my boss. Then I got pulled out of the meeting that I just stepped back into, and it was a massive just shit show. It was a massive embarrassment to me, and it was a pain in the ass. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't my fault because my boss wasn't bothered by it. He just brushed it off. But the guy complaining had a very logical point that he was complaining about. There was no emotion. He was very deadpan on the phone, and so I didn't take it seriously. So is there different types of emotion, or do they all come from the same place, even though outwardly they might appear different?
I'm not a psychologist. I'm a rhetorician. So what I can say is the way to respond to different kinds of anger, as the anger has been expressed, should be the same. So by the way, a great way to express anger is just what that guy did to you. And I used to do this with people who worked for me back when I was a manager. If I really wanted to terrify somebody, I would, start speaking very quietly and very directly, and be the calmest person in the room. But I would also, give them my hawk expression and look very directly into their eyes. And, if they weren't crying at the end, I hadn't succeeded. Now, that's a way of expressing anger. And yet the way they could deal with me at their very best was exactly what we've talked about already. Switch to the future, acknowledge your mistake, talk about your own feelings rather than mine, and move on.
So final thing, because this just came to mind then. Is it different dealing with someone who is an emotional mess, and so you know that they don't understand any of this, they don't practice any of this? Is there a difference between dealing with someone like that versus if you were to have a complaint from a politician who was trained? Or again, is it the same process, but perhaps you've got to be a bit sharper about it?
Well, there are times when you simply have to cut off the conversation, and that's the art of the occasion as well, right? I mean, there are times when you're in a realm I call the unpersuadable, where, you could simply say, look, obviously, this is not the time to talk about this. Here's what I'm going to do right away for you, and then let's get back. If the person is too emotional to talk, it's what you do. Yeah. But on the other hand, the big thing is if there's one takeaway from this whole conversation, it is make sure you know what your goal is at the end. Because often salespeople will make the mistake of saying it's about the sale right now. And sometimes that's necessary. On the other hand, more important than that in general, as you have to maintain the relationship and strengthen it if possible.
Love it. Perfect place to wrap up here. I've got one question, Jay, that I ask everyone that comes on the show, and that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
Well, I have to give you an obvious answer. I would have studied rhetoric. It's one of the first of the liberal arts. I went to a really good college in the United States that had never taught rhetoric, and to this day, it's not taught in the Ivy League. I would go to a school, if I had to do it over again, and learn as much of this art of persuasion as possible. There's nothing better to study in college.
Amazing stuff. Well, with that, tell us a little bit about the book for everyone who's really enticed, as I am, after this conversation and want to learn more about all of this.
Aren't you nice to ask? I stumbled on rhetoric at Dartmouth College, one of the Ivy League universities. When I was working there, I was really bored in my job, and I found a book by accident that had been signed by President of the United States, John Quincy Adams. And he was actually teaching this art, and he listed all these books that I ought to read. So he was my advisor. For the next 17 years, I drove my family crazy, partly because I was looking for a modern textbook that would explain this art of persuasion, and I couldn't find any that wasn't just dreck, horrible stuff. So I thought the only alternative was to quit my job and write this book. So it's based on classical rhetoric and modern rhetoric and neuroscience as well. But I also talk about, how to solve problems with your family, within a business setting, and I talk about politics as well. I mean, as you could say, my wife thought this book was going to get this rhetoric stuff out of my system. The dumbest thing she ever said. It's just made me more passionate about it. It will save the world as well as your own job.
Amazing stuff. So it's called Thank You for Arguing. It's available on Amazon. We'll link to it in the show notes of this episode as well at salesmanpodcast.com. And with that, Jay, I'm conscious of time here, but I could talk to you for hours on this because it's fascinating, and there's multiple levels to both what we've described, I guess, which is the practical element of it. And then probably we could both ponder, neither of us being psychologists, we could probably both ponder on why it works as well, I'm sure, after a couple of pints down the pub. So I appreciate your insights, mate, and I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
I'll hold you to that pint. Meanwhile, it's a pleasure, Will.